folks, Mrs. Hauser here. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about calling methods and conditional statements, static methods, a few different things. There'll be a few different videos that guide you through these just to keep the videos a little bit shorter and not so long. So I'm going to start with just how we use methods and conditional statements. So in order to call a method, which we've been doing a bunch of, you want to write the method name, followed by parenthesis. The parentheses are really important because they indicate to Java that we are using a method and not a variable, for instance. Inside of those parentheses, you want to be sure to put any required arguments. Okay. And I'll give you an example of a few of those. So some examples might look like using our move method with a 5 inside. You could also use the move method that does not take any parameters. You could maybe use set location and set your object's location to 0, 0. Something else you could do is you could set your location. When you set that location, you could use parameters that look something like this. And I'll give you another example of doing that. And what that is doing is it's just using a method to pass those arguments, and that's okay. You can use methods to pass arguments as long as their return type matches the parameter type. Okay, Okay, so let's look a little closer at that set location that I just used in the last one. So I'm going to write that out up here. Okay. I'm just going to take a minute to pull up our API. That came from Actor, so we'll look at that. There we go. Give it a second to load. You guys know my internet is really slow because I use a hotspot, so I apologize. I'm going to pause the video until it loads for you. I'm sorry. Okay, and we're back. So you'll notice that if I come down here and I look at my set location in X into Y, it takes in 2 integers. So I'm just going to write that onto here. So both of these need to be integers. And let's go back and look at our getX and our getY method. And if you notice, the return type over here that I'm highlighting for both of these are integers. So we're allowed to do that. Okay? So now I want to talk to you a little bit about conditional statements. We have used conditional statements in Scratch, so you should be fairly comfortable with the idea of an if statement. So now I'm going to give you some formal notes on that. So conditionals are our if statements, and we put something inside of parenthesis, and then we use brackets to tell our if statement where to start and stop. I'm going to use 2 backslashes just to indicate in my code that I wouldn't want that compiled. I wouldn't use this when I was actually coding, but if I were to write out what I am right now, I would. So what we normally call what I just did is, and I'll put a little note over here, I just commented that out. And that would mean that the compiler wouldn't look at those lines of code because I have put those 2 backslashes in front of it, so I can type in a comment to myself, or I could put some code that's not quite working inside of them. So that way I could get the rest of it to compile. Inside of the parenthesis of that if, I'm looking for a true or false response. And a fancy name for that true or false response is a Boolean statement. And you'll notice that there are a lot of return types that we see that are called Booleans. So I'm going to show you an example of using an if statement. But first we have to find a method that we could use an if statement with, because an if statement requires a Boolean to go inside of that set of parentheses. So let's come back to our actor API and look and see if we can find a Boolean that we recognize. Well, I see Boolean is at edge. So that's the one that I'm going to use. Okay. So an example of using this would look like this. I might tell my crab to move. Okay. And then I would say if, and remember that my Boolean has to go inside of those parentheses. So I would put is at edge, and I'm indicating to Java that I'm using a method, so I open and close my parenthesis. I need to tell that if statement where to begin and where to end. And if it is at the edge, I want it to turn 180 degrees, so I want it to turn around, and I want it to move, I'm going to tell it to move 15 spaces, just a little bit faster there. Okay, so here in this conditional statement, I have my Boolean right here, and I have my code that will happen if it's true. So let's take a look at what that looks like in Greenfoot. So I'm going to open up the crab classes act method. I'm inside here going to put the same thing I have. So I'm going to put move. I'm going to open and close my parenthesis to indicate to Java that I am using a method. I'm then going to type if, and I'm going to open and close my parenthesis. I'm also going to open and close my brackets right away. You don't have to do what I do as far as opening and closing the parenthesis and opening and closing the brackets right away. I like to do this so that I don't forget and have missing brackets. Okay, inside of my if statement, I'm going to write is at edge, the method that would give me a Boolean. But what I need to do is use an open and close parenthesis after I type that to indicate to Java that I'm using a method. Inside of my brackets for my code for my true results, I'm going to tell my crab to turn 180 degrees and put a semicolon, and I'm going to tell him to move again 15 spaces. I want you to notice something. After my if open and close parenthesis, I do not put a semicolon. The reason being is that a semicolon tells my if statement, I'm done. It tells the compiler that I'm done with this line of code, and I'm not done with this part of the code. I'm not done telling the compiler that if is at edge is true, I have to tell it what to do. It thinks that if I put a semicolon right here, it thinks that it doesn't have to do anything. It thinks it's done with that if statement. And what I want to indicate to the compiler using these parentheses is that I want to turn and move if that statement is true. So let's go ahead and compile our code. And if it looks just like this, you should have no syntax errors. And I'm going to put a crab on my screen. And I'm going to hit act and see what happens. He moves, great. And then I'm going to hit run and let it continuously use that act method. And what you should notice is that your crab is bouncing across the screen just as mine is. So I'm going to end this video here. you can pick up the next one right after this. But in between, take some time to add the code that we just talked about and use a conditional statement. If you want to add something extra, feel free to.